venture to say that what we saw wasn't some sort of a marketing mistake. I think what we saw was a very intentional transgressive act by some people out there who want to continue to tear down and beat down what we would say is the very conscience that God has built into the mind of every single person. Hi, welcome to the Kingdom Christians podcast. I'm glad you joined me today. This podcast is not like a current events sort of podcast, and that's not what I want to do today. But I do want to talk about a current event, a current happening. Actually, in some ways, I'm behind the eight ball on this because it happened about 4 or 5 days ago. So this news broke a few days ago, and when it happened, I got to be honest with you. What I felt like doing was getting on a podcast and doing a rant because there was so much going on. But like I said, this isn't a current events show. This is a show that is about going deeper, discovering what it means to be a kingdom Christian, and how can we live in our culture as kingdom Christians. So I don't want us to be kind of reacting to current events, but I do think it's really critical that we see the connection between what's going on in our culture and the broader, more important worldview issues that we need to be aware of. And even more importantly, the deeper issues of us as Christians learning to discern and grasp what's happening. So what was the event? The event was Netflix released marketing posters for a new show that they're going to do. It's called Cuties. It's based on a French film. I'm not going to show you the picture right now, but you can go look at it. I'm going to be honest with you. This is not me speaking as some sort of like super conservative, guy who's afraid of things. But what you're looking at in this picture is the depiction of 11-year-old girls dressed in insanely provocative dance clothes in positions that, in modern parlance, twerking, kind of showing them off their bodies. And these are clearly pre-pubescent girls, and it wasn't just Christians who went off the hook. Everybody went crazy about it. There were 160,000 people signed a petition to change it. Netflix had to come out and say sorry. It could have affected the career of the original writer of the French film, who's a French woman also of African descent, and who had written this film and was actually trying to critique the sexual exploitation of children. And here Netflix packages it in a way that's totally sexually exploitive of children. So that was the event, and it raised a huge stink, as it should have. And a number of things came to mind. The first thing is that as Christians, Jesus said we need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And I think sometimes as Christians, we respond, or we see something in the news and we see it as an isolated thing. This was not a marketing mistake, okay? I mean, it was a mistake in that there was a huge controversy, but it was not a mistake. Somebody spent a lot of time determining how to depict those young girls in a photograph. Somebody spent a lot of time thinking about the message they wanted to send about what they were creating and what they were making. You don't create a worldwide marketing campaign overnight. It goes through the hands of lots of people. In other words, there are a lot of people involved in this decision and looking at this, and it goes through thought. And so what you see whenever you come across an ad campaign or anything like that, what you are seeing is not a mistake. It is a carefully calculated, carefully crafted message based on a set of values, okay? That's the first thing I want us to understand, is that as Christians, we need to be interpreters of the world that we live in, and we need to understand that beneath all of these sorts of things, there are values that are being represented. And so Netflix may have been embarrassed by this. To be honest with you, I'm not sure that they were, but they might have been embarrassed by this. But it wasn't a mistake in the sense that it was an accident. Someone snuck something through. So what does it represent? What is represented in that? Well, there's a lot we could talk about. In recent years, there's been a whole lot that's come out about a lot of the culture of Hollywood, sexual exploitation of children, directors, famous directors who have to live outside the United States because of sexually exploiting children. I mean, these aren't things locked behind closed doors and only accessible in the dark corners of the internet. These are things that are out there. Okay? So that's one of the things we can look at. I think another thing that we need to think about is that in our modern culture, the revolutionary forces that are at work, that are really at war with the Judeo-Christian heritage of our country, right? And when I talk about that, I'm never saying that all the people in the United States were Christians. What I am saying is that we were the inheritor of a worldview that gave an organizational reality to our culture, that helped inform the ethics and the morality and the perspective on reality that was out there, right? So there's been a revolution that's been going on against that worldview. It's been going on for a century now, okay? And the revolutionaries who are going against that, in the most recent years, one of the central tenets of this, one of the central acts of these revolutionaries is called transgression or transgressive acts. What that means is they seek to undermine normal mores, the things they want to push the envelope, because the further you push the envelope, the less the traditional morality is able to stand up. And I promise you, there are people out there today who are doing those very things. So I would venture to say that what we saw wasn't some sort of a marketing mistake. I think what we saw was a very intentional transgressive act by some people out there who want to continue to tear down and beat down what we would say is the very conscience that God has built into the mind of every single person. You know, the Bible says that when we walk away from God, we seek to suppress the truth. We suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And that's what transgressive acts are. So whatever the human actors involved in this might be thinking in their own minds, I can promise you that there is a plot. I mean, there is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy that goes back to the Garden of Eden. It's the conspiracy of the enemy of Satan and his forces to bring death and destruction to God's good creation, right? And that is what we see taking place right now in our culture. Christians are getting, I think, wound up by a lot of things, and when you get focused simply on the human element, then what you start looking for is a human solution. And that's the problem right now, is that the problem that is eating away in our people today is it's a problem of the soul, right? It's a problem of the heart. And until we address that, we're in trouble. So we as Christians, we need to understand something, that our goal is to be able to look out with eyes of discernment. Paul did that. We read about it in Acts 17. And Paul was with his friends. He was traveling around. And we read about Paul in the city of Athens. And it says, now when Paul was waiting for his friends in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus. That's the place where ideas would be weighed and judged, and justice would often be meted out, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting." Now, there we see Paul understanding the root cause of all the things that are going on. At the root of this is the issue of idolatry. And let me tell you something, before we try to analyze our culture and say, well, the problem is bad politicians, or hey, we need to drain the swamp, or the problem is fill in the blanks, whatever issues that you might want to look at and point to. What we need to understand is at root, all of these things flow out of hearts that refuse to worship God and instead worship idols. And here's what's fascinating. You know what you find in a culture where idol worship is the predominant force, where idol worship trumps worship of the true God? You can look around in the ancient world and we have an answer to that question. You know what happens in those cultures? What you see is every form of vile practice. Paul would talk about this in a lot of different places. Often prostitution, sexual exploitation of other people, sex slavery would have been part of these things in the temples. Even more than that, you would see child sacrifice. In many of the homes in the ancient world in Canaan, they would find jars that inside these jars were children that had been sacrificed to the gods, wrapped up, put in these jars, and built into the walls of a house because the sacrifice of the children was expected to bring blessing upon the lives of the family. Do you think we see anything like that in our culture? We see it everywhere. We see in our culture the excess of the fulfillment of sexual appetite everywhere. And in many ways, people are searching for something spiritual in the sexual. That's what happens in a pagan world. They're searching for something. They're searching for something that can only be fulfilled spiritually in the presence of God, but they're seeking it via the sexual. And that's taking place everywhere in our culture. And in fact, the institutions of our culture are built up. Whole industries have been built up to support this new form of worship. What is pornography? Pornography is an industry built on the broken lives of those who help create it, that allows those who consume it to, in a way that doesn't involve anybody else in their thinking, consume of it and experience something, seeking to replace a spiritual void with a sexual act. What is abortion? Abortion is the safeguarding of sex without consequences, which of course we know is an absolutely false concept. There's no such thing as acting as people embodied creation without there being real consequences. Abortion safeguards that ritual, the pagan ritual that we live in our culture. So this is what happens when a culture increasingly goes from worshiping the true God to worshiping idols. There is always going to be a replacement. There's going to be a pagan element that enters into the culture, and that's what we're seeing right now everywhere you look. And if you begin to look at the world through this lens, the biblical worldview lens that says the fundamental issue of your life is who are you going to worship? Who are you going to serve? You're going to see it. So what's that sick, crazy, unbelievable poster for this show all about? It's all about an expression of this culture that has increasingly chosen to worship false gods. And we as Christians, our job is to come and to speak into that culture. Paul, he stood up in the midst of the Areopagus and he said, "Men of Athens, I perceive in every way that you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also there an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Believers, we have to have not only a message that we can proclaim, we have to have an experience that we can share that is itself a proclamation. The pagan world that we're living in that seeks spiritual fulfillment through sexuality, they want something. They want union. They want communion. They want a sense of completion. These are the things that are offered in those different forms of sexual activity. A desire for something. And we know that the only place where the soul can truly be satisfied is in the presence of God. That's the only place. And you know that too. I mean, if you've stumbled, if you've fallen, if you've acted outside of God's rules and law, then you know that whenever you go after something, whether it's sexual or it's fill in the blanks, that ultimately it doesn't give you the completion that you're longing for. It doesn't give you the satisfaction that you're longing for. It leaves you wanting more. And that's the dangerous thing. That's where we see these extremes begin to enter in the culture and in the lives of individuals. Because here's the deal. What we find out really quickly is that the completion, that the satisfaction we're looking for, that is a spiritual need that we're seeking to meet in some sort of physical way, that in time, the way that we've been seeking that, it doesn't satisfy, and so we search for more and for more and for more. and it ultimately leads the soul to consume everything around it. And if it could, it would consume itself. That's the dire reality that we're living in right now. And we as Christians have been given a message of hope, and it begins with us receiving that message of hope. So I want to just close this episode by encouraging you to think about some of the things we've been talking about. If we are only left to be bemoaning and bewailing the things that we see out there in the world, or becoming upset by it, or even just trying to stand up and tell people how and why they're wrong, what do we have? Not much. We don't have a lot of hope. But we've been offered something so much more, so much better. We've been offered the reality of God's presence. We've been offered the reality of walking into his purposes and his plan, but even more than that, walking into his presence and experiencing his presence. And actually tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. The Lord wants us as his people to be able to share a message that flows out of something we've actually experienced. And so I just want to close by saying something really simple. If we're not experiencing God's presence, then that's what we need to seek for ourselves first. We ourselves need to seek the fullness of the kingdom, which is found in his presence. Because it's when we've done that, when we've experienced his fullness, that we're able to live in the world in such a way that the heaven that resides in our hearts begins to shine out through our lives. That's it for today. Let's us be the light. Let's us be the light in a world that can sometimes be so dark and confusing. For now, goodbye. God bless.